Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live. It is Tuesday afternoon, July 12th, and today we are going to be sort of taking some big picture looks at some of these stories that came out from day one of NBA free agency. While we were live on air yesterday, we got news that Klay Thompson is leaving the Golden State Warriors for the first time of his career on his way to Dallas in a sign and trade. So I want to get into sort of how that looks for the Mavericks next season coming off of an NBA Finals appearance and whether or not that is something that is replicable with some of the trades that have taken place so far, trades and transactions, and all of their moves. I also want to dive into sort of what is next for the LA Clippers considering where they're at now, letting Paul George walk in free agency, and I think that rudderless would maybe be being a little bit dramatic, but at the same time, I am not sold on the direction they're heading in, so I want to dive into what is next for them. Yesterday, we also got the news that the Celtics ownership group was planning on selling the team, so we will be diving into that, the best free agents remaining in the NBA, and then we are going to wrap up the show by talking a little NHL free agency as well, where it was a very eventful day yesterday, so we will dive into all of the biggest storylines coming from there. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us all of your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a tip or donation with a comment, that comment will pop up on screen for everybody to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated there. Like I mentioned, we were live yesterday when the Golden State Warriors agreed to a sign and trade with the Dallas Mavericks to send Klay on his way. So now that we have gotten the opportunity to sort of sit back and fully ingest the news that broke out, wanted to come back around to this discussion and revisit what went down there. So the full deal was the Mavericks got Klay. They had to send 2 second-round picks to the Warriors, and to make room for Klay Thompson, they also had to send Josh Green to the Charlotte Hornets. Now, sneakily, I really like this addition for the Hornets, who were able to just sort of cash in on an opportunity to acquire a young, promising player. And I honestly do think that after hiring Charles Lee this offseason and a lot of the young talent that they are starting to amass, that they can work their way into a little bit more of a winning culture there in Charlotte. So that, just as an aside, is something that I did want to give them love to. But ultimately, this deal is about the Warriors and Magic, or Mavericks, I should say. The Mavs gave Klay Thompson a 3-year deal worth $50 million. In terms of average annual value, he actually took a cheaper deal than what the Warriors had offered him. A 2-year, $48 million deal was reportedly on the table from Golden State to Klay Thompson, and that would have been $24 million a year. But it was clear that there was a diminished relationship there between Klay Thompson and the Warriors, and that he, for the past year, has sort of known that he wanted to part ways with the Warriors. Now, we talk about whether or not it's right for the Warriors to let him go, or whether or not this is a good signing for the Mavericks, but the question that sort of stood out to me is this the right career decision for Klay Thompson? Because I can understand why he feels slighted by the Warriors. He's seen multiple players around him get these big deals from Golden State. Andrew Wiggins and Jordan Poole just got these big contract extensions in 2022. Draymond Green was almost rewarded for what was a disastrous 2023 for him, where he ended up punching Jordan Poole in the fall and ended up getting paid as, I wouldn't say directly as a result of it, but it didn't deter the Warriors from spending big on him. And then, just being a distraction all of last year as well, Klay Thompson is sitting here in this offseason saying, well, you didn't really hesitate to give out the big money to any of these other players, giving them, $100 million. And I can understand the human aspect of what is going on with Klay Thompson, especially after a year that has been, you could call it emotionally charged, where he sort of had to have a coming of realization to reality in terms of the fact that he just isn't the same basketball player that he was for a number of years. And he was yanked around in terms of his role, if he was starting or coming off the bench, whether or not he was playing in these closing minutes. And when you're talking about a rhythm shooter like Klay Thompson, obviously all of those mental aspects can also play a role in how he ends up shooting. So it was a down year for him, but from his perspective, he has also still done far more for the organization versus what these other players did in order to earn them contract extensions from the Warriors. And now the second luxury tax apron obviously plays a very massive role in all of this, because if it weren't for the restrictions that the Warriors would be facing, I'm sure they would be more than happy to give Klay Thompson the legacy contract that he feels he deserves. But at the same time, they're bumping up against that second apron. I think $24 million a year for Klay Thompson is almost more than fair. But at the same time, just in comparison to these other deals, his ego came into play, which you can't necessarily blame him for. But that being said, we can justify his emotions. Does that mean it's the right decision for his career to step away from the Warriors? And ultimately, if he is just trying to be in a happier situation for himself personally, take the basketball out of it, that he feels he's going to be better off in Dallas, it's hard to blame him. And he's going to a team that was just in the finals last year, so it's not like he's taking this massive contract from some bad team that was just trying to establish a culture or whatnot. It's Klay Thompson trying to compete once again at the highest level, and the Mavericks should be in a pretty decent position to do so. Now, all of that being said, in terms of what Klay Thompson currently is at this point in his career, my eyes told me that it could be just about over with Klay. Now, I do feel like with his pedigree of knowing that he is one of the best shooters of all time, if he can just sort of bounce back into his typical ways, and last year was a bad three-point shooting season for him, and he still shot 39% from three, including the majority of his looks being from above the break, which is a massive need for the Mavericks that we saw down the stretch of their postseason run, that they had players who could knock down threes in the short corner, but outside of that, players above the break just were not hitting their shots, and the Celtics were willing to live with those attempts, and it ultimately burned them. So Klay is somebody you have to think is going to be comfortable in that type of a situation, and he is going to, again, you would think, have an opportunity at least to get a number of open looks with the amount of creation that Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic create for themselves and others, that he could absolutely be a bargain at $17 million a year for the Mavericks these upcoming years. Now, the biggest question / concern I have with the Mavericks is the idea of, are we sure that the defense is going to be just as good next year? Because they became an elite group in the NBA last year, and the fact that they did so, I thought, was one of the biggest surprises in the league. And that is for a couple reasons. The fact that they had some of these unknowns in Derek Lively, who they took in the lottery last year, and they end up trading for Daniel Gafford. They had elite paint protection, which is something that they still have again next year. I do think that their coaching staff, I know that Jason Kidd has been definitely ridiculed at times, and I'm not sure if it's him or they have Sean Sweeney, I believe, is the top assistant in Dallas that was getting some love in the head coaching carousel this past offseason. But, overall, their coaching staff was really good schematically in terms of being able to overcome maybe some of the deficiencies of their lack of point of attack defenders in Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. But part of that was also predicated in the depth that they had at the wing position. And that is a little bit of a concern because of the fact that they traded Josh Green in this deal to get Klay, and they also saw Derrick Jones Jr. walk in free agency, and he signed with the Clippers. And I do believe, Klay Thompson, we know he's been on an all-NBA team or an all defensive team in the past, and that he has been one of the, highest level of 3-and-D players in NBA history. That's not necessarily who he is anymore. I just feel like the athleticism with him since those injuries from 2019 to 2021 just render him a different player. And it would be awesome to see him be able to recapture that defensive energy. I just don't know if it's something you can rely on. Now, he can still be a very important rotational piece if he is knocking down threes, even baseline at the percent that he was last year. Obviously, you'd like to see him step up a little bit more in those big moments, but I do worry about the downgrade defensively. I think it's pretty significant from Derrick Jones Jr. to Klay Thompson. Now, they did sign Najee Marshall to a 3-year deal worth $27 million. Marshall was a bench piece on the Pelicans, and I don't think that the Pelicans get nearly enough love in terms of the depth of that roster, but he is a very nice defender that can play some minutes for the Mavericks probably next year as well, so I do like that. Again, though, talking about bench minutes, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Mavericks choose to balance those different minutes, but ultimately, Klay ends up with, I don't know if you would call Kyrie Irving a rival. Of course, they played in 3 finals against one another in the mid-2010s when Kyrie was on the Cavs and Klay was on the Warriors. So there's maybe a little bit of a rivalry there, but Kyrie was ultimately a part of the recruiting process, according to NBA insider Mark Stein. We have seen Kyrie and Klay take the court together on the international stage in 2014 in the FIBA World Cup, and 2016 on the Summer Olympics. So ultimately, I'm sure all the fences are going to be mended. And again, I do believe that Klay has some real value upside of moving into this new role with the Dallas Mavericks. So for the Mavs as a whole here, we've seen them bring in Klay, Marshall, and Quentin Grimes as well, was a part of that Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. I think a pretty decent pickup, somebody who could potentially get some bench minutes for them. They lost Derrick Jones Jr. and Josh Green. So they'll likely be in a similar position next season, around that 4th, 5th seed, maybe a little bit higher. We'll see. In terms of regular season in the NBA, doesn't quite mean as much. So we'll see sort of how ready they are at the beginning of next year after a long, obviously, season this past year in making it to the finals. But we'll see. I still think they have a decent chance. They are in the upper tier of contenders in the Western Conference. Now, very quickly, I want to dive into the Warriors side of this because there is an interesting conversation in terms of what is their front office doing. And it is especially interesting because of the fact that we just saw the turning over of responsibilities where Bob Myers stepped down after the 2022-23 season, who Myers had been holding that position for the majority of the dynasty, and he sort of called it quits there, and Mike Dunleavy Jr. takes over after that season, so he's now going on one full season. And the moves that he's made have been a little bit underwhelming. The Warriors as a whole have been in this really awkward spot. So he traded Jordan Poole, who was once this very promising young player, and shipped him out for just about nothing. It was the Chris Paul deal along with a couple other assets, and Chris Paul ultimately walks in free agency for nothing. He gave Draymond Green the contract extension, and again doing so after all of the controversy in the 2022-23 season with him punching Jordan Poole. And now Klay Thompson walks in free agency and officially sort of breaks up the core of this Warriors dynasty. And there is criticism to be had for Dunleavy that this has not been great for the Warriors as of late. Now, what I will say is he took on a very difficult position with an expensive roster and a lot of bad contracts. You know, the Jordan Poole deal just sort of never should have gotten done in the first place. Bob Myers almost jumped the gun a little bit on that, and it ultimately turned into one of the worst contracts in the NBA. So no, he wasn't going to get much in return for Jordan Poole. And, you know, the Warriors still don't necessarily have a definitive direction that they're headed in. It's Steph Curry and a number of talented young pieces in, you know, you go to Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Pajemski, Trace Jackson Davis. Maybe you want to throw Moses Moody in that conversation as well. And you still have some of the, you know, pieces from that 2022 championship in Draymond Green and Andrew Wiggins, but not quite at the same value level as what they were previously at. And it's a mixed deck of cards right now for them. And I don't know if there really ever was a move that was staring right in front of them that would have drastically made them better. Because keep in mind, Dunleavy was also a part of that draft to bring in Pajemski and to bring in Trace Jackson Davis to have this little bit of extra energy about what the future could be in Golden State, or the idea that they could start to package some of these young players and some future draft capital to go out and make a splash. They kicked the tires on Paul George. Lauri Markkanen as somebody that has been rumored about. I would actually love to see Markkanen end up on the Warriors, but I don't think that it's fair to criticize Dunleavy just yet. It is a lot to ask there, and they are sort of stuck in this expensive middle ground right now, which isn't too far off from where the Los Angeles Clippers stand as well, especially after Paul George left in free agency. So we are going to dive into what the plan is for the Los Angeles Clippers, but before we do so, we have to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way, you know, be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's some motion shit. kinda stupid if you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we are continuing to reflect on some of the biggest moves and news that broke yesterday afternoon during the first day of free agency. And of course, the biggest story was that Paul George is leaving in free agency, leaving the Clippers and his hometown of LA to go across the country to the Philadelphia 76ers to unite with Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. So just to recap a little bit, the rift between Paul George and the Clippers organization came because Paul George wanted a fourth year attached to whatever contract he signed, and the Clippers weren't willing to do that because they didn't want to have so much of their salary cap wrapped up in George, Kawhi Leonard, James Harden, and others who are headed into their late 30s. And Paul George ends up getting that fourth year with the Philadelphia 76ers, a 4-year deal worth $211.5 million, fully guaranteed through 2026-27, and then he has a player option the next summer for $56.5 million as he heads into his age 37 season. So that is undeniably a lot of money to have tied up in somebody at 37 years old, and someone that, you know, it's one thing when you're talking about LeBron James, who is defying all of the expectations of around aging in the NBA and what that traditionally looks like, but it's not always that pretty. And for somebody in Paul George who has had at least some share of injury concern in the last handful of years, I'm probably not as concerned about it as a lot of other people are. But since coming to the Clippers, it's fair to note that last season was the first year in his 5 years with the Clippers that he played more than 56 games in a season. Not to mention he missed the entirety of the 2023 playoffs when they ultimately lost in 5 games to the Phoenix Suns. But last year was a positive note for him, playing 74 games and getting a number of votes for an All-NBA team. Ultimately falls short of that, partially due to the fact that, you know, he was dealing with some injuries very briefly again, and the Clippers, who were red hot in the middle of the season, were dipping off, you know, as the season went on. Now that's probably even more so and due to Kawhi Leonard and his absence, but that's sort of a separate conversation there. But Paul George is a star in the NBA that I don't believe is over-reliant on his athleticism. Now, don't get me wrong, his highlight reels from the Pacers years, and even a little bit that year he was top 3 in MVP voting in 2018-19, I believe it was, when he was with the Thunder, have some very athletic moments. But I honestly see him as a little bit more of a finesse scorer at this point than he is a physicality scorer. And he has a very reliable three-point shot that can fall off the dribble or off the catch, and somebody that I think will be valuable in Philadelphia when you already have a definitive 1A in Joel Embiid, that he is going to be a second or third option because Tyrese Maxey is there as well on his new contract, and I think it's going to be a tremendous fit there. As for the Clippers giving this contract to him with a fourth year, again, I understand that there is a little bit of concern with the age there, and the fact that he may even age better in Philadelphia, being able to not be the number one option there as opposed to with the Clippers, where you never really know, considering Kawhi Leonard. Is he going to play? Is he not? If he's not, Paul George is the number one, and I just don't know how much you can rely on Kawhi's availability. So I can understand the concern that maybe the whatever it is, $57 million almost when he's 37 is more intimidating for the Clippers than it maybe is for the 76ers. But the reason why I justify it for Philly and I would have for LA is the fact that both of these teams are pretty all in on the current situations that they are in. Now, I think the Clippers far more so than the 76ers, where the Sixers aren't even necessarily grasping at straws for draft capital in the future. It's just that with Joel Embiid at 30 years old, they feel like they have to speed up this timeline maybe a little bit more to try and maximize what Embiid has. For the Clippers, they have, after this year's draft, they had 1 second-round pick. They have 0 draft picks until 2030. So none in the next 5 drafts. And that is a pretty scary thought to, at that point, you're already so invested in the now. Who cares if in 4 seasons Paul George is going to be making more money than he's probably worth at that point? Because at least his presence on the team now, and the majority of people will tell you, listen, they weren't winning anyways, and the odds would be in your favor by making that statement, but at least you can talk yourself into a potential path maybe of the Clippers trying to make some sort of a run with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard fully healthy. At this point now, I don't know where you find any level of that type of optimism with the Clippers for next year. And the fact that they are already an extremely expensive team. According to SpotRack, the number is currently at $183.5 million for their payroll next year, which is already in the first luxury tax apron. So yes, adding Paul George would have easily put you in the second apron. It would have made you, more expensive from the ownership standpoint, but also in terms of what other types of moves they are able to make. But I don't know if there are moves out there anyways as things currently stand for them now, where we've seen them sign Derrick Jones Jr., which isn't a bad pickup there. They brought back Nick Batum, who they had previously traded in order to receive James Harden at the beginning of last season, and they added Mo Bamba. Some fine additions there. I mean, the reality is, Derrick Jones Jr. and Nick Batum can give you rotational minutes. Maybe Mo Bamba can be a big off the bench for you. And maybe they have some sort of trade package that they could work out with the Denver Nuggets for Russell Westbrook. Westbrook opted into his option, and it's being rumored that the Clippers are maybe looking to shop him and that the Nuggets are one of the prime candidates there to get Russ if he's traded. Maybe the Clippers can pull something off to get one of their draft picks from last year, and maybe best case Peyton Watson to add a younger player that could possibly contribute now or could be a piece of whatever you are going to try and continue to build in years to come. Again, they're in this really awkward middle ground right now, I think, and they don't have a single player on their active roster younger than 24 years old. They have Bones Highland and Kevin Porter Jr. as their 2 youngest players. There is basically no assets for the long term here, and if that's the case, why not just try and max out right now? And it's going to take a miracle Kawhi Leonard run at this point for the Clippers to come anywhere close to winning, even making a Western Conference Finals at this point. I mean, genuinely, I just think the West is so much better than them at this point. But they are on this super expensive payroll and sort of similar to the Warriors, even though the Warriors, I think, do have more long-term upside. What's the point of this for the Clippers? And unfortunately, I think the answer is for them to just try and manufacture whatever level of interest that they possibly can as the franchise just invested in their own arena and that they're trying to make a name for themselves outside of the Lakers. With this iteration of what they have, I don't know if I see that happening, and we could head into a really rough stretch of years here for the Clippers. And, you know, I'm not sure what the Kawhi Leonard contract is going to be in a couple years for now. It's one thing if they're just trying to sell out as much of the arena as they possibly can in this first year, then see if you can maybe get a haul for Kawhi Leonard. But I think next year he's going to be $50 million if he isn't already there coming into this upcoming season. So I don't know. We'll see. But I think the Clippers are in a pretty dark place right now, and I just don't know how much better it is going to get. Now, they would almost have to hope next year that if they are going to be competitive, that Harden declines his $36 million player option, and that if they can try and sit in a similar position as where the 76ers were this past offseason, where they try and position themselves to find the next disgruntled star and pull them away in free agency. I don't have the list of names that are necessarily going to be free agents next year, but let's say things don't work out in Cleveland, or, you know, God forbid something crazy happens with the Bucks. We all know that for years now the national media has been trying to pull Giannis away from Milwaukee. I'm definitely not associating with that idea necessarily, but, you know, at least the idea of, we just saw the Bucks have a really weird offseason and we still haven't seen them do anything, which is probably something we're going to get to in the show in the next couple days. But they have been doing nothing in free agency so far. So if Giannis were to have another, if the Bucks more so were to have another season where they come short of, you know, the conference finals, let alone the second round, again, who knows, maybe something crazy could happen. But as we know in the NBA, there always is that next disgruntled star coming. So again, that kind of feels like the best option for the Clippers from this point on, to pair up next to Kawhi Leonard, and I just don't think that is a reliable process whatsoever. So we'll have to see how all of this plays out. Clippers could be in contention for a play-in spot next year, but I think a lot of the teams that were behind the Clippers in the standings this past year have a great chance of jumping them, where literally just quickly running through here, the Clippers were the 4 seed. Mavericks have a higher ceiling than them. I would say that the Pelicans are probably going to be a better team than them next year. You can make an argument for the Kings, the Rockets, the Grizzlies you could even throw in there as well. And that's, you know, with a number of other teams that are behind them as well, such as the Suns, the Lakers, the Warriors, and others. So we'll see how this all plays out. But, you know, this whole experiment between Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, it really is disappointing, because I think that if we were to run this back and guarantee health with Paul George and Kawhi, it could have been a ton of fun to watch. And we were never able to reach that point, and it's unfortunate that this is sort of how it's going to go down in history, as one of the bigger disappointments in recent NBA history. But, you know, if you're taking these players at the peak of their powers and pairing them up with one another, I think it would have been, you know, must-see TV, and we just never fully got that. And it's disappointing, but, you know, that's the risk you play when these organizations are committing all in on teams and making all types of aggressive moves. And you could say the Celtics have made some aggressive moves in the past couple years. Now, obviously, their foundation is built off of Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, but they've made a number of trades to round out their roster, and it ultimately resulted in them winning the 2024 NBA championship. And they have all of this accumulation of talent, and as a result, one of the most expensive teams in NBA history. And because of that reason, they are in a great position to contend next year. But also, it ties into the fact that the Boston Celtics ownership group is now looking to potentially sell their team, which is the bomb that was sort of dropped yesterday afternoon amidst all of the free agency drama. So we are going to dive into all of that. But first, a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. It is what we just alluded to before the break. Yesterday, as we were getting all of these free agency details coming out, we also got the news that the Boston Celtics ownership group, led by Wyc Grousbeck, who has been the governor of the team since 2002, is planning on selling their share in the Boston Celtics. So this is definitely came as a surprise to me. The process is going to begin either later this year or in early 2025. There is a timeline put in place according to the statement that the ownership group put out in terms of the fact that Wyc Grousbeck is going to remain the governor of the Celtics until 2028. Now, Wyc led this purchasing of the Boston Celtics in 2002. They bought it for $360 million. As Kelsey in the comment section right now on YouTube here is asking, is Wyc Grousbeck broke? Well, if he were to be at this very moment, which I don't think is the case, that's going to come to an end very quick, because after being a part of this buy in 2002 for $360 million, Forbes estimates the Celtics franchise value to be at $4.7 billion. Now, Forbes, they put out this article every single year, so that was headed into the 2023-24 season prior to them winning the championship, so we could even see maybe that value be a little bit higher. Sportico estimates it to be at $5.12 billion, I believe it is. So, one way or another, Grousbeck and this investment group is going to make their money back and a lot more since then. Yes, you heard that right. $4.7 billion according to Forbes. So it is really crazy, and it's interesting considering the fact that during this offseason, we have seen a lot of these franchises sort of tiptoeing around the luxury tax and trying not to step into those first and second aprons where the bill comes back. Especially there's a repeaters tax and such, where if you spend a number of years in the luxury tax, that you are going to get hit hard with the bill. And there is a very large bill on the way where, according to WEEI, a Boston-based radio network, they had a report that the luxury tax bill for the 2025-26 season, so, a year from this upcoming season, the luxury tax bill is estimated to be at $250 million. So that is a lot to take on, and for that reason, we see the ownership group trying to sort of move their way out of having to pay this consistent massive bill. And it's the expensive roster that the Celtics have put together. They haven't been scared to, make moves. And again, listen, I know the Celtics aren't the most popular franchise according to, the national consensus, but something that as a sports fan myself, I always root for is ownership groups that are willing to spend. I want them to succeed because it almost is a statement to the rest of the it's almost a statement to the rest of the league of, this is how you put together a championship. And I thought that the Texas Rangers winning the 2023 World Series was a nice example of that. And now the Celtics in 2024, we're seeing the results of spending big actually paying off. But some of that big spending for the Celtics includes a couple of deals that they made just yesterday as well that I want to briefly touch on as we talk about the finances of the situation surrounding the Boston Celtics. Jason Tatum became the highest paid player in NBA history with a 5-year, $314 million contract extension. Like I mentioned, highest paid in NBA history. He's going to be the first ever player in NBA history, I believe, to make $70 million in a single season, which is what it's going to be in his final year. Now he has a player option there. Sure, even if he opts out of it, the Celtics are going to, give him another deal, which is probably even more money there. So I recorded a short on this yesterday. I don't want to dive into it too long. This was a no-brainer in my eyes for the Celtics to give out this type of contract to Jason Tatum, who is entering his prime. I do still feel like there is, parts around his game that he could clean up a little bit to elevate his game even further, and he just delivered a championship, so there was really no question about it. And I would say for the most part, there was no question about them giving Derek White this contract extension as well, where it was a 4-year deal worth $126 million, so that's another one where, over $30 million sounds like a lot, and it definitely is a lot. But at the same time, you're talking about a starting caliber player on a championship team. He just showed it last year, and we're seeing all of these massive contracts being handed out that you can make an argument this could end up looking like a bargain. Now, ultimately, I think it's a fair price, but, there are a couple different ways to look at it. And we do have a couple comments here from Eric Rodriguez of our own GSMC Sports Network. He said, Joe Mazzulla for president. Boston's success is all about building team chemistry instead of constantly trading for players trying to force success, such as the Clippers, Suns, Lakers, and now Philly. I agree. I think the team construction of this has been absolutely phenomenal. And you definitely have to credit the ownership as well that this isn't possible because of Kelsey. I wish we were signing those types of contracts here at GSMC, but maybe someday. But to, Eric's point, it's not possible if not for the ownership group being willing to, invest into the organization in this way. And it has been tremendous to see the way that the team was able to develop under Joe Mazzulla and seeing the chemistry really form over the past couple years. Anytime you got any of those top 6 players for the Celtics in a press conference, they were talking about the idea of sacrificing for one another for the ultimate goal, which they ended up getting done. So it was just put together in the right way in my eyes. But this does lead to a point where, especially with a new ownership group coming in, you can't expect them to be able, it's not sustainable to have a roster this expensive for this long. Now, for a couple years, the Celtics can get away with being in this second apron because of the fact that they already have all of their top guys under contract and some of their bench players as well that you can sort of throw into the rotation. And they've done just an excellent job top to bottom with this organization really ever since, again, Wyc Grousbeck in, his route to winning 2 NBA championships since he took over the team. Done an excellent job, I feel like, with personnel in terms of general managers Danny Ainge and Brad Stevens. A pretty terrific lineup there. A number of excellent coaches as well that have helped the Celtics get to this point. And it's going to be probably a little bit worrisome for Celtics fans to some degree, because ownership is, I think it's one of the most underrated things in sports, because a franchise can just be put in purgatory if they have a bad ownership group that isn't willing to invest or chooses to be overly hands-on. That's why I think what's been so great about Grousbeck is he's spent the money when he's needed to. He has understood his role, that it does not include being so hands-on with the organization. So feels like the Celtics are in this point where what they have on the books for the next number of years is a recipe to potentially be a dynasty, but it's still a conversation, especially now with whatever this next ownership group is going to look like. Now, one of the co-managing partners of Grousbeck, it's Steve Pagliuca or something. I apologize for the mispronunciation there if I got it wrong there, but he has been alongside Wick through the entirety of his purchasing of the franchise, and he released a statement where he's going to be participating in the bidding process for Wick's portion, so that could be a potential good sign. When Grousbeck was taking over the Celtics organization, part of the big thing for him was that he is a fan of the Celtics, and he wants to see them succeed just as much as he wants to see himself succeed. So that type of a mindset, if the Celtics could replicate that, would be great. But it still probably would lead to a situation where the next ownership group is probably going to have to make some moves that isn't incredibly, inducive of winning basketball games. And what I mean by that is the fact that they are probably going to have to cut some costs at some point along the way to get under the luxury tax. And that could mean sending off, a fan favorite or two along the way, as the Celtics' top end of their roster is so expensive that they're going to be able to get away with it for another season or two. And I wouldn't say that their window is coming to an end by any means, but it is something to take into consideration when you're talking about this Celtics team that a lot of people have gotten very excited on in terms of how many championships could this group end up winning. So I think it's funny to some degree also that Grousbeck built up this super team, spent all this money, got all this money on the books for years to come, and is going to walk away from the table before he has to fully pay off all of those debts. He got everything that he wanted in this transaction, and it was Banner 18. That was really the priority for him. He comes away with it. And now there are going to have to be people stepping into a very passionate sports city and try to explain why this model that they have is not sustainable for, years on end. So I think the big thing for Boston fans is just anybody but John Henry and the Fenway Sports Group buying the team. There's, of course, the, screenshot about the fact that the Fenway Sports Group is interested in buying a basketball team someday. And, if you are from Boston, you understand the discontent that there is between Red Sox fans and the Fenway Sports Group for their lack of investment. So that's pretty much worst case scenario there for Boston fans. But again, a lot to sort of iron out there, and we will have to see over time. But want to reorient back into free agency here, as today has definitely been quieter. A lot of the big names were moved yesterday, but there are still some impactful players that are on the open market for teams to pick up. So we're going to be diving into a list of the top players that could be contributing players next year. But before we do so, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk some NBA free agency. I want to take a look at the top players remaining. This wasn't necessarily seen as the overall best class in, free agency history, but there are still a number of impact players. We saw the big names of Paul George and Klay Thompson go off the board yesterday. There were some other impactful players as well that were sort of shuffled around. The Kentavious Caldwell-Pope to Orlando deal, or some other sort of marginal things. I meant to mention this earlier as well when we were talking about the Warriors, but I do actually sneakily, if he's healthy, really like the DeAnthony Melton to the Warriors deal that they signed there. So, we've seen probably the majority of names fly around, but at the same time, there are still a number of players out there that could be contributing players on good teams. So I want to dive into who is still out there available. Now, the number one name, of course, is LeBron James. We know he's not going anywhere. He's going to be sticking with the Lakers. Obviously, one of the big questions is how much is he going to sign for? There were rumors that he would be willing to take a pay cut to help the Clippers, or help the Lakers, that is, try and acquire some extra talent. But I'm not quite sure necessarily how many players out there would be worth taking a pay cut for. One of the names that was thrown out there, though, was DeMar DeRozan. And we'll keep it brief here on this note because we just talked about it yesterday, of the idea of DeMar DeRozan to the Lakers. What he provides is just giving a legitimate, consistent third option. And I'm sure that DeMar, for almost personal reasons, would love to come to LA, being a growing up in California, that is, and, always sort of having those hopes. Now, the issue is DeMar doesn't provide three-point shooting, which is something that the Lakers obviously need, and he's also, on the other end, not necessarily an elite defender either. So he doesn't give, either of those skills, but ultimately, the Lakers, that is, it's a little bit of an argument in terms of what you think they need to improve on the most. I feel like at the end of the day, if they could get DeRozan on a reasonable price, somebody who can just go out and give you a bucket is always going to be a solid investment, especially if he would maybe be willing to take a hometown discount to go alongside LeBron James. You take advantage of the fact that LeBron is willing to take a cheaper contract as well. That might just be something that is worth investing into, but I do understand the reservations that are with that as well. I wouldn't argue that it's the perfect fit by any means, but even outside of the Lakers, DeRozan is a player that I do think can provide, he's not a number one. I don't know if he's never necessarily ever been a true number one. Obviously, some of those Raptors years in the 2010s were special, but I do think that DeRozan can, establish real playing time for himself, and not just that, but being maybe a secondary creator to a star. Now, I had talked about previously that the Knicks could maybe interestingly be a team for him to go to. Obviously, that is no longer possible with the salary cap situation. Not sure what DeRozan's chances are here, and we'll see if he does end up on the Bulls. I really hope that's not what the case is, but it would be it almost feels like it would be kind of indicative of who DeRozan is and who the Chicago Bulls are, but we'll we'll let it be there because, again, we just did a bunch of content on DeRozan yesterday. But some other players as well that I think could be a starter or six-man on a competitive team. Tyus Jones, Gary Trent Jr., and Miles Bridges. Jones is a point guard that has been, I think, underutilized the past couple years. He didn't get anywhere near enough shine when he was on the Memphis Grizzlies, especially when Ja Morant was dealing with the suspension and potentially even the injury as well. You know, the Grizzlies were the 2 seed for consecutive years, and their record without Ja Morant was so impressive because Tyus Jones did an excellent job of stepping up and just helping to orchestrate an offense. That's what he does. He controls the court, and he does so in a quiet way. He's not this, overly prolific scorer necessarily, but he's absolutely somebody that I think any NBA team could benefit from having. And I think that if there are any contenders out there that have an opening for Tyus Jones, I mean, I don't know. I think that the Mavericks still have their mid-level exception open. Could be interesting. Obviously, it's so Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving dependent that maybe Tyus Jones, I don't know if he's too much of a spread the ball around type of player that it would sort of cause some disruption in their offense that is often more isolation heavy. But, just an idea out there. I believe the Lakers have their mid-level exception open. The Clippers have theirs. So Tyus Jones could end up playing some really impactful minutes somewhere in the NBA next season. Gary Trent Jr., I feel like, is a little bit more of a role player than somebody, Tyus Jones could be somebody that could almost operate a second unit by himself. Gary Trent Jr., I think, is a plug-and-play type of skill set in terms of the three-point shooting, can be a reliable option for you. Has spent the past couple years. I just think he's been, overall very good for a number of years now. And you go back in his career and, if I'm not mistaken here, I feel like he had at least a couple moments going for himself when he was with the Portland Trail Blazers at sort of the end of that still competitive era with them. So he's somebody that I would definitely be potentially interested in if I am a team that has an opening on my spot as well. Last year, if you look at his shooting percentages, shot 39% from three, actually, one of the higher marks of his career, and he did so on 6 attempts per game. Started 41 games, so again, either plug him in the starting lineup or coming off the bench. Eric in the comment section, Gary Trent Jr. shot 50% on catch and shoot threes. Lakers chances, again, if they could, I'm pretty sure they have that mid-level exception open, which is basically just, it's $12.9 million. It's a roster spot that was created by a previous move, and it's just something that the majority of these mid-level exceptions, and listen, I'm no expert on it necessarily myself, but I know if they could fit Gary Trent into potentially going on a one-year deal for $12.9 million, we'll see. He is still, it's crazy actually, like as I'm, on Basketball Reference here looking at it at the same time, that he is still just 25 years old. Feels like he's a little bit more of a vet, that he's been around the league for a number of years now. So I'm not sure if he's going to try and cash out necessarily somewhere as he heads into his prime. But I think he'd be a great fit on the Lakers, and he's somebody I would absolutely, if I am the Lakers, try to recruit into the building, because he's a very reliable player that I think is a very capable offensive player. So I would definitely keep my eyes on that. And Miles Bridges, obviously he has the off-the-court stuff that makes him a little bit of a pariah, and I do think that if it wasn't for, the situation, that he would have been paid big money by now by Charlotte, because he's been a 20-point per game scorer the past couple years that he's actually played, and he's had some big moments, and I think that he's capable on the defensive side of the floor as well. I understand it feels a little gross for any of these, championship contending teams to spend money in this way, but if you're desperate, he's somebody that can absolutely help a team. And again, on the court wise, I don't think there's any question about it. We just saw Kevin Porter Jr. get a contract from the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, Miles Bridges, I think that basketball skill wise is significantly better than that and could end up commanding a decent amount of money. But again, obviously the off the court stuff is something that you have to at least acknowledge in these situations. But the last handful of players here that I at least just wanted to reference that I think could possibly be in the rotation of a good team. Monte Morris, backup guard, spent this past year with the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Detroit Pistons. I feel like I could see him carving out a role for himself. Kyle Lowry, of course, the veteran, been in the NBA for a number of years. Kind of annoying on the defensive end, and he'll do his share of complaining and flopping maybe, but an extremely heads-up player with a ton of experience. Buddy Hield, the shooter. Kyle Anderson having a little bit of two-way ability. Still just 30 years old. There were rumors that he was maybe looking at the Boston Celtics, which would be a very interesting pickup for the Celtics there. And then Gordon Hayward as well. Obviously, never worked out for him in OKC, but maybe if he had the right opportunity, he could sort of come back to at least having some type of a tangible role in the NBA, but we will have to see there. But as all of our attention here on the GSMC Sports Podcast these past couple days have been on NBA free agency, we did also just get the beginning of NHL free agency, and I want to hit on some of the key moves and storylines that have taken place on that end as well. So that's what we're going to be diving into next, but first we have to take our final break of the show. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are going to be diving into some of the storylines from NHL free agency. As all of that was taking place yesterday, I wanted to sort of wait on it and see what the situation was surrounding some of these big deals. And obviously the eye-popping biggest story in the National Hockey League is the Nashville Predators making moves, where they brought in 3 big-name players, where they go after Steven Stamkos, Brady Shea, and Jonathan Marchessault. And this was a little bit unexpected from a Predators team that in the past couple years, granted, has been at least in the realm of being competitive, but this past season just not good enough, and they ended up being a first-round exit. So they pour a lot of attention into this upcoming season. Now, obviously, out of this group, the number one most surprising thing is the fact that we are seeing the end of the era of Steven Stamkos in Tampa Bay, where he was the first overall pick for them in 2008. He became the all-time points leader in Lightning history with 1,044. And, you look at a recent expansion franchise in Tampa Bay, Stamkos has been there through really all of the biggest moments in franchise history, and he's played in just about 45% of all-time Lightning games. So he ends up leaving in free agency, which is, again, you talk about Klay Thompson and the years that he spent in Golden State on the NBA side of this. Another really hard ending for two parties that saw a lot of success with one another. Stamkos, as he built up, the first 16 years of his likely Hall of Fame career, was able to win 2 Stanley Cup trophies with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and ultimately it just ends like this again in a little bit of an unfortunate way. The reports were that the Lightning were sort of lowballing Stamkos during these contract negotiations for a good while now, and he is ultimately chasing the money, where he's going to get $8 million a year in Nashville. Sort of a no-brainer move here, especially considering the offer from Tampa was reported to be somewhere closer to the $2 million a year mark. And he, at 36 years old, Stamkos, or 34 years old I should say, he is going to try and take advantage of all the money he can possibly get at this point. And again, for Stamkos, probably ends his time in Tampa as, I would argue, maybe the best player to ever suit up for Tampa Bay, at least the greatest overall legacy with the team. Now, Martin St. Louis, you can throw into that conversation as well, but the end of a historic run here for Stamkos in Tampa Bay. Feels like he should have retired a member of the Lightning, but who knows, maybe we'll see him swing back around at some point as he's on his way out of the league. But they also get Brady Shea, of course, who was a defenseman for the Carolina Hurricanes for the past couple years, and also pick up on Jonathan Marchessault, who was one of 2 players from Vegas's championship winning team of 2023 that left in free agency. Chandler Stevenson went to the Kraken, but Marchessault, the Conn Smythe winner in 2023, he ends his little brief tenure there with Vegas, but definitely had some highs in there. So we're going to see some changes from Vegas, who feels like they probably had a little bit of a better opportunity than they gave themselves a chance to. Came into this past year's playoffs a little bit underseeded and ultimately had to face off against a very difficult Dallas Stars team in the first round. They end up losing in 7 there, but I'm sure that there are definitely Knights fans out there that feel like they could have better capitalized on this past year. But that is it for them. We will see how they're able to respond next year. But for Nashville, this was a very big day for them, obviously, where postseason didn't go the way that they wanted. They've at least been sort of inching their way back into contention once again over these past couple years. But ultimately, they provide the spike, bringing in 3 real impact players and sort of at least winning the day in terms of all of the headlines. But I want to shift gears a little bit here to the other side of the NHL in the Florida Panthers, of course, the reigning champions, checking in on their moves. They brought Sam Reinhart back on an 8-year extension, and obviously, Reinhart has been an incredible pickup for them, where for a couple years there, he was one of the, better assets in terms of value of what they got him for when they traded for him. I believe it was when he, from Buffalo, where he had spent the majority of his career playing there up to that point. And now last year in his age 28 season has a career year with 57 goals, 94 points, and was incredible for them in the postseason as well. Came up in multiple big moments there. So that was a nice signing there. They did lose Brandon Montour, who walked in free agency. He signed with the Seattle Kraken, so we had just mentioned the fact that they got Chandler Stevenson. They were able to pick up Brandon Montour as well, where the defenseman got 7 years, $50 million from Seattle. I can understand sort of the situation here for the Panthers of just kind of having to let him go at this point, being headed into his age 30 season, getting 7 years on the deal. The Panthers still feel like they are going to be in a very competitive place next year and probably for years to come with this Reinhart extension. And ultimately, I don't think it would have made sense for them to overpay with the situation going on with Montour, so they let him go as the Kraken make another move there. But also in the Eastern Conference, and a team that the Panthers saw on their way to winning the Stanley Cup Finals this past year, the Boston Bruins made a couple moves. My team, of course, being from Boston. They signed Elias Lindholm to a 7-year deal worth $54.25 million. This had been sort of thrown out there for a good bit, and ultimately it comes to fruition. They get the runner-up of the 2022 Selke Trophy. He had a down season last year offensively when he was traded from the Flames to the Canucks, but he played better in the postseason. That sort of limited some of the concerns there. He had 10 points in 13 games, and the Bruins were in desperate need of getting some improved center play on the first couple lines ever since Patrice Bergeron retired, headed into last season, and they just didn't have enough talent on those top couple lines. Now, there is definitely a little bit of questions there in terms of, is Lindholm capable of being your top line center? That's something that the Bruins are going to have to find out. But ultimately, this was a position of need for them, and they ultimately attacked it. They also took. They also signed Lindholm's teammate from last year, Nikita Zadorov, to a 6-year deal worth $5 million per season. This is actually now the third different team that Lindholm and Zadorov will be teammates on. It was previously the Flames. Both were traded to the Canucks on separate deals, and now both of them signed free agent deals with the Bruins. So a couple nice pickups there for the Bruins. Now, in all of this action, actually, outside of free agency, the Bruins and Canucks also saw a swap where the Bruins traded Jake DeBrusk to the Canucks. So, an interesting move here. It's going to be a 7-year deal for DeBrusk worth $5.5 million annually. DeBrusk, he had a little bit of an up and down tenure when he was with Boston throughout his career, and there were some, questions as to his level of commitment to the team. He requested a trade, of course, a couple years ago, and ultimately they were able to iron things out for a couple good seasons from DeBrusk, but I can understand the reason why the Bruins organization didn't necessarily want to pay him long term. Now, that's not to say this is a bad move for Vancouver, where DeBrusk is still a very talented player, and obviously there was sort of some personality stuff that didn't necessarily seem like a match between the Bruins and specifically it was when Bruce Cassidy was their head coach. But even still, just a little bit of butting of heads over the years there. So DeBrusk gets a little bit of a fresh start in Vancouver, and again, a very talented player, so not a bad move for the Canucks either. Couple final notes here. Patrick Kane returning to the Detroit Red Wings. It seemed like he was on his way out at the end of the season. It was a pretty brief stint for him in Detroit, and coming off of that last game of the year, he was potentially hinting at saying his goodbyes to Detroit and the organization. There were a lot of rumors about him ending up with the New York Rangers, but he comes back to Detroit which obviously just for the legacy of Patrick Kane is always going to be notable. And then we also saw the New Jersey Devils sort of build up their defense a little bit with a couple signings. Brett Pesce and it was Brendan Dillon that they brought in. So a couple potential top liner defensemen that the Devils ultimately went after. But, you know, still a lot to track down here in the NHL free agency as well. A lot of things to dive into, but we are running out of time here on the GSMC Sports Podcast. Kelsey commented, "Are you on Twitter?" You can check my personal Twitter out. Not extremely active, but would like to eventually get more active as the years go on. You can look at Mabardy TJ, that is Mabardy TJ, if you want to check us out there. Of course, also be sure to check out the GSMC Sports Network on socials as well, where you can see some of our more exclusive short content. So definitely be sure to check us out there. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and we will be back tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern, so we will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.